Alrighty, let's begin this stuff. So I'm going to start the live stream. Alrighty, so as you can see, today we're going to talk about fragments in Kotlin. Got a lot to talk about today. I'll show you kind of the initial concept of it. We'll develop a quick little app to show you the concepts of it, and then we'll get a little bit more in depth and advance further on, but hopefully this will make sense to you. It's a little, might be a little bit confusing at first, but we'll work through it and hopefully it makes sense. And shout out some questions if you got them, and I'll keep an eye on the live chat to see if there's any questions there. But before we begin, just want to recommend this book. I kind of talked about it last class a little bit, where we're talking about design patterns and building large applications. And this book, while it's talking specifically about game programming, does cover those design patterns, and actually, in my opinion, covers it in probably a better, more understandable way, because it's talking about games rather than concepts like maintenance, car maintenance apps and restaurant finding apps and stuff on Android, which could be exciting, but I don't know, when you're talking about orcs and dungeons and stuff like that, it makes the content a little bit more exciting. So anyway, I recommend this book. It's I'm only about halfway through it, but it's good so far, and one I highly recommend so far. Just nicely written book. It's not dry at all. Doesn't say, okay, this is how you implement it. Again, it's dungeons and orcs and fun things like that. So definitely recommend that. I'll put the notes into the repo as usual. So anyway, let's talk about fragments. So fragments are probably not what they sound like in Android, but let's just go through the definition of what these are. This was first implemented in Honeycomb, which is 3.0, and Honeycomb was the first operating system, the Android operating system, that came out for tablets. So this is about the time that tablets started coming out, and Android needed an operating system that handled that. But you can't really handle that well with activities, because if you want to build a single application and have that be deployed to both a phone format and to a tablet format, then that same activity might not work for that layout versus another layout of different screen sizes. And so they decided to implement fragments. And fragments live within activities, and you can have all different layouts inside of an activity. And what fragments also allow you to do is reuse code. So one of the examples I gave in a previous class was when you're implementing like a Google map, and you want to have that Google map next to, let's say, a list view, or next to a bunch of buttons. And in another spot in your application, you also want to show that map view and have some other widgets or whatever, different screen. And then maybe on a tablet, you might want to put more widgets because now you have a larger screen real estate. Fragments allow you to do that, because before we weren't able to reuse that code as easily, because a lot of the code had to live in the activity itself. And again, if you're having different screen layouts, that was very confusing, because one, you'd have to know what layout you're on and have a bunch of if statements, like if you're a tablet, do this and this and that. But with fragments, all of that logic code lives within the fragment class itself. And so you can kind of think about it as an activity that you can have more than one of. And before, if you remember, we can only, and actually still, you can only have one activity on the screen at a time. You push one onto the stack, and that makes that visible. You pop it off the stack, and that makes the one below it visible. So again, fragments are going to allow us to have a lot more flexibility. All right, so as I mentioned, fragments are very similar to activities, but we can have multiple fragments on the screen. They all live within one activity, but here's the life cycle of a fragment. So as you can see, it's very similar to an activities lifecycle where we have the onCreated at the very top left. But before we get to onCreate, we have something called onAttach. So when you're attaching a fragment to an activity, or namely putting it onto the screen, that callback gets called. So onAttach gets called, and then onCreate gets called next. So you have a little bit of, before your UI is created and everything, you get another entry point into that. And then after that, before we even get to onResume or on start, whatever, we have onCreate view. Okay, so what happens is the fragment gets created in our onCreate, and then in that one, we can inflate the view there, but the layout, there's a lot of different elements that are not in the fragment when that gets created, and so that actually gets put off into the onCreate view, and we'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then after onCreate view gets called, then that state is where we get the created state. And then after that, on activity created, so yes, this is where the activity actually gets created. And then we start our familiar life cycle of on start, on resume, on pause, going back up the chain, on stop, and then on destroy, but not just on destroy view. And then is this fragment being retained? And if it is, then we do on detach, which means something happened where the fragment's going away, but we want to retain it maybe. And if we are retaining it, it just says, well, I just removed it out of the activity that it's currently in, so you get this on detach callback. But if it lives inside an activity and that activity is going away, and then we're not retaining this in any memory, the garbage collector comes and grabs it, then on destroy gets called, and then on detach finally. So you can put a lot of your teardown code in either the on destroy or in after that in the on detach. And on detach gets called whether it's getting destroyed or not. So again, handle it appropriately. And so this allows us a lot more flexibility because again, when we pop off activities from the stack, they may or may not get retained. Most of the time they go away. If you get a phone call and you switch out, that activity might actually get destroyed, and then when it comes back, you have to recreate it via that on bundle, the bundle instance, pull out the variables from the bundle, blah, 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 that we had to deal with. But because fragments give us a little bit more flexibility, we don't oftentimes have to recreate the views, but the views might go away, but the fragment always stays around, no matter if it's on the stack or not. So again, with the activity, comes off the stack, it almost always gets destroyed. Fragment, it comes off the stack, you can retain that memory, which means if you're using, let's say, Google Maps, that piece of data has a large overhead because there's map data, there's tile data, there's a lot of image data in there that you might not want to have to reinstantiate because instantiation takes a little bit of time. So you can actually retain that, keep it in memory, and then reattach it to some other activity. So again, a lot more flexibility. So how do we create fragments? They're very similar to activities, as I mentioned. Create a simple class, name it something, and then inherit from one of the fragment superclasses. So there, in this example, it's just fragment, but as with our activities, we have support activities, we have support compat or compatibility activities, and we have the same thing with fragments. So there's like, I don't remember, at least 4, but I'm sure there's more different types of fragments, fragment classes, and they all come from different libraries. So if you're ever getting some weird error, go to your imports and see if the version number, and I'll show you what this looks like when we get into the code, but make sure the version are all matched throughout your apps for the app compatibility library. So sometimes there's like version 4, sometimes there's version 13, and they're all named exactly the same, kind of, sort of. And if you import the wrong library, the names are the same, but the class will be different. And so you can't have this fragment. You're trying to declare this fragment as a fragment class, and you're like, yeah, I know they match up, but again, they're different packages, so they're technically different classes. Okay. So inside of that fragment class, we have the onCreate, just like we do with our activity. But here's the difference. In activity, onCreate, that onCreate method is a protected class. So it's technically file private, which means only that class can access that. And technically, the activity manager can call that function. However, Fragments onCreate is public because we need to call onCreate the Fragments onCreate from another class. So they actually make that public versus protected on activity. But we still do have a fragment manager. We'll get to that in a second, as opposed to a activity manager. And then here's the main difference. So as I mentioned in the lifecycle, we have an onCreate view. In the onCreate view, we have a parameter that gets passed in called inflator. This is what we're going to use to take our flat file, which is that XML layout file. It's a flat file because it's just text with nothing in it. And we're going to inflate it into an actual view. And the second parameter that's passed in is called a container. It's a type of view, and this is just going to be as you can see, the container for the fragment that this is going to be in. So in case you want to access the view that this fragment is in, you have a parameter to that. And then we also get the saved instance state that gets passed in, just like the onCreate method has. All right. So inside of our onCreate view, this is all boilerplate code. So you get this code as part of the process when you install or when you add a new fragment file. So you get this. Actually, I'm sorry, this is my modified version. What you get is a single line. Like, this is all on one line. It just returns the inflator. So let me just explain. I'll tell you why I broke it up in a second. So it'll say like return and then inflator, double exclamation point, and then inflate, and then you pass in the fragment layout ID as the first parameter, the container, and then whether it attaches to the root is that third parameter. And then that returns a view that you can actually manipulate, and it has all the widgets contained in it. You can set values on those widgets, like in edit text, you can fill in the data or in the text, etc. And then you return that view to who's ever calling this particular method. The reason I broke it out is because if you just inflate that layout, that flat file, and return it, you're not able to manipulate the UI elements, attach button listeners to it, or click listeners to the buttons. You're not able to add in text to either your labels or your edit text or anything like that. So I just break it out into two different lines of code, and then you can put the stuff in the middle there. So how do we actually manipulate or change the UI elements? Again, click listeners or changing text inside of text fields. We use a version of find view by ID, our method that we like to use all the time. But this one's obviously different. Instead of finding a view, it's find fragment, and this will give you the fragment itself, and then from the fragment you can go ahead and get the ID, get the view by ID from that fragment. So we first need a reference to the fragment itself, if you don't already have it. And I think I skipped a slide. Yes. Okay, we'll do it in code, but I think I left out a slide here because we skipped a small step. But let me just move on. All right, so if we want to do anything with this fragment, once we create the fragment and we want to attach it or anything like this, let let me go back one thing here. We have this thing called a fragment manager. And again, this is going to manage all of our fragments just like our activity manager manages all the activities. So when you push or create a new activity through an intent, that goes through the activity manager. We do the same thing with fragment manager. So this has a list of all the fragments in our application. You can say find fragment by ID, and if it already exists, your fragment manager will give it back to you. If it doesn't exist, it'll create it for you and then pass it back. So you never have to worry about that kind of management on the fragments. All right, so the support fragment manager is a version of the application support library, so that's why it's called support fragment manager. It's just a variable within the support activity class as opposed to just the regular activity class. So we call it support fragment manager, and then we have this this builder chain, which is a design pattern. There's a design pattern called the builder, and you've probably seen this if you're familiar with Java, which all you are. But on that we say begin transaction. Everything that happens after begin transaction is going to get put into a queue, and then once we have that last line of code dot commit, everything in between those two lines of code gets committed and basically happens at kind of the same time. And so we can have different animations happen on our fragment. So if we want, for example, our fragment to kind of fade in or slide in or do some kind of animation, we can add a line of code for that transition, and the second to last line is our transition. So we just say, hey, we want the fragment as it comes in to do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or as many things as we want. Okay, now go ahead and do it. So let's go through these. So what I'm doing in this particular just example line of code is I'm replacing whatever's in the frame container, the ID that has frame container in it, and I'm going to replace it with that gallery fragment. If you remember from the previous slides, that's just what I call the fragment that I got a reference to. And then I want to add that transition, or that adding of the fragment to the container. So I maybe tap on a button and I want the screen to change. I want to add that to the back stack, because when I hit the back button on Android, I want that to go back to the previous fragment, let's say. And so if you don't want that to happen, leave that line of code out. But if you do want that to happen, say, okay, I click on this button and something pops up. If I hit the back button, it goes back to the way it was, just like an activity would. That's what that line of code is. And then set transition, we have a whole bunch of fragment transactions, transition, and there's transactions. Transit fragment open, so I'm just saying this fragment's getting open. There's kind of a little pop-in transition that happens. And then again, we call commit. That goes ahead and does all those things of code. So maybe you've seen this before in other languages, but want to do that. All right, so let's take a step back. In order to create a fragment, we just, like if it was a new fragment, we didn't get it from the fragment manager. We want to create it in memory rather than, again, getting it through the fragment manager. We call fragment new instance on that fragment, and there is a, that's more like a singleton class. I'll show you the code here in a second that Android Studio generates for us. So we just talked about how to create it, the onCreate view, and then of course all the other lifecycle methods are pretty much the same. You can kind of imagine how those work, but just wanted to. All right, so let's see. I am going to, that's our last project. I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to go down to our navigation drawer activity. I'm going to select that one. And we're just going to call this Fragments. In my example code, use KitKat, I guess, doesn't really matter. Okay, while Gradle's building that thing, let me kind of show you the application. My computer doesn't lock up. All right. So let's go through this code a little bit once this finishes building. All right, so this one, obviously, because it's from a template and there's a little bit more going on than just our empty activity, we have a few more lines of code and kind of looks scary, but at the same time, if we just go through, it's pretty easy. So we have our set content view, which is going to take our layout called activity main, and it's going to set that as our root layout for this activity. So we've seen this before. Here's something else. We're going to set a support, so this is coming from the support library. We're going to set an action bar. So there's going to be a new action bar that goes across the top, and we're going to have the ability to kind of change the wording on that depending upon what screen we're on. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Then we have this floating action button, and that's going to be that button that goes in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and we just set a click listener on it. And so for this particular example, we have what's called a snack bar, and not really sure why it's called a snack bar. It's a bar that comes up from the bottom of the screen, and it has a message. So you might be used to, if you've done any Android programming, and some of you have done it in your other projects, you've used toasts. So a toast is just a little kind of like a text bubble that pops up. A snack bar is the new toast. So in the later versions of Android, we are using snack bars more than toasts. It's more, I guess the UI matches what Google's trying to accomplish, where there's a message and it kind of comes up rather than just kind of appearing out of nowhere. Again, it just follows their ideology a little bit better. So use a snack bar instead. We can show you what that looks like. The next thing is a toggle. So there's a toggle button, and that's going to actually activate our drawer that comes out from the left-hand side. So it's pretty simple line of code there, but that's what that does. If you hit it again, it dismisses it. Add that to the drawer layout, and then set navigation item selected. So what's going to happen is we have a nav view, which is the navigation in that drawer. We're going to set the selected item so that when you tap on that item, you get a callback. We have an overridden method in this activity called onBackPress. So if you ever want to override or change the behavior of that back button, this is the place to do it. This is just going to close the drawer in this particular case. There's an options menu, which has its own layout. We'll get to that in a second, but we have a menu inflator, and that inflates that layout that's in. So our R class is our resource class. Just as a quick review, inside of a resource class, we have a folder called menu. So somewhere in here, right here, we have that menu, and then it's called menu. It's called main, and there's our main layout there. So we're just going to inflate that menu. What does that menu look like? Well, it just has one item called settings. Okay, so here's that callback that I mentioned on navigation item selected. In Kotlin, we have this kind of like a switch statement here. So just pretend when is switch, and then we have all of our cases under that. So when I select the ID nav camera item, do something. When I select nav gallery, nav slideshow, manage, share, send, do this. So right now it does nothing. And then finally, after you're done doing nothing, close the drawer. So we'll have our application do something in the meantime. Let me go ahead and build this really quickly let's go ahead and make it as I show you our main activity. All right, so as I mentioned, if you remember in the onCreate method, we have this set content view to activity main. So this is what it actually looks like. But if we go into the text for it, there is a big old include, which includes another layout into this layout, so that's kind of nifty. And it's including the app bar main, and then underneath it is our navigation view, nav view, and, oh wait, nope, sorry, this one, nav header main. So if you actually go back to the design and you say, well, I want to change the text for this import button. This is the drawer, by the way. Say I want to change the text of it. You can't actually do it because this is a layout within a layout. So here's our include, and we can include any other layout that we want to. And then here's our nav view. So what I can do is I can double click on that, and that'll bring up that file, which in this case is our activity main drawer. And then go down to, let's say, our nav camera, and instead of changing it from import to, I don't know, let's just say take photo. Show you that works. No big deal. The image itself, we can change. So right now it is using the kind of the built-in icons that come with it, but we can change that to anything that we want to. Right now I don't have any other resources in my project, but you can change this to pretty much anything. These are all the ones that come with Android, so these are the built-in ones to the Android operating system. I don't know if this will look any good, but let's just change it to something random. And there you go, just change it to a star, and you get the idea. The main thing is, this ID is called nav camera. And if you remember, that's where back in our switch statement or our when statement, back in the main activity, when I select that, this code gets executed. All right, so that should be done building. Let's go ahead and play this on. I should start this up too. Our Pixel 2. It's fragments yet, but there's really no way for us to change what's on the screen without using a fragment. So right now this is using a layout. So here's that toggle menu button. That drawer slides out. I can say take photo, nothing happens. So it just says hello world there. Go down to tools, nothing happens. If I click on this, they call it like an overflow menu sometimes. If you click on that, you see that's where our settings menu was. And that callback is on options items selected. So if you ever want to have a menu and have options there, this is going to work exactly the same way as our toggle switch here. So let's dismiss that. Here's our floating action button. Right now it's an email. You can add a plus sign to maybe add some data or whatever. That's a pretty good place for that. But okay, so right now, again, this doesn't do anything useful. And in order for us to say, well, let's go from taking a photo to looking at the photos that we've taken, so going from take a photo to gallery, we're going to need to display something on the screen. And again, back in the past, we'd only be able to change the activity. And so as you can probably guess, if we were to put a new activity on top of this, it would cover up our current activity, including the menu, all this fun stuff. And in order to bring that back, we'd have to duplicate code. We'd have to put this navigation bar into that second activity if we wanted that to persist. Instead, we're going to change out what's in this white area with a fragment. Okay, so in order to do that, go into your package. This is just called Fragments because that's what my application is called. You can right-click on it, go to New, all the way down to Fragment. So before we were using activities, go down to Fragment, and you can select either a blank fragment or a list. We haven't talked about list views yet, but it's just a list of data. Let's start off with a blank fragment, which will be probably the easiest without a whole lot of other boilerplate code. let's call this gallery fragment because that's what was in the example code from the notes. Okay, so let's talk about these options here for a second. Do I want to create a layout that's associated with this fragment? So yes, I want to have a UI to this fragment. Can you have a UI-less fragment? Yes, you can actually. Just like activities, you don't actually need a UI for the activity. Or you can have no activities. Just have the application itself. Include a fragment factory method. So this is actually going to be the code that gets called when you call new instance. And if you don't want that functionality, if you want to be able to create multiple instances of this fragment, you might want to uncheck that. And then we have interface callbacks for when this fragment gets created. Let's see, created, selected, that you can get a callback in the fragment class itself, letting you know something's happened. We'll take a look at that. So you'll actually, sometimes if you add a fragment and you don't implement the interface, your application will crash. So, but I'll tell you why it crashes. And so let's purposely crash your application, because I always do that when I'm adding fragments. Not always, but I always forget to implement the interface, and then the app crashes, and I go, what the heck? All I did was just add a fragment, and yeah, you'll see here in a second. All right, so this is again the boilerplate code that gets created for Android Studio. It's going to allow you to create the fragment with 2 different parameters. So again, if you're trying to implement your own Google map or something, these might be a latitude and longitude coordinate that you can then instantiate your Google map with, and you can imagine what else you can put in there. All right, and then we get down to our class definition. Again, I called it a gallery fragment. It inherits from the class fragment. However, if we go into our imports, you can see that our fragment in this particular case is version 4 in the support library. There is another type. Let's see if I do that, it says, oh, I don't know what fragment is anymore. And if we do Alt-Enter to import it, you can see that, well, maybe you can't see that, but a little pop-up that popped up says, all right, do you want to import it from the android.app.fragment package or the android.support.v4.app.fragment? So again, be very, very careful which one you use. Just make it consistent throughout your application. Usually, if you're trying to support a version of Android that's a little bit earlier, you're almost always going to use the support library. And again, that's supporting earlier versions. So I just went ahead and selected the support one, and again, it did the automatic import for me. So again, if you have some kind of weird error that you're trying to create a fragment and you're trying to create a fragment of type fragment and it's expecting a fragment of type fragment, and you're like, that is the same type, it's probably because of that. I always run into that. Anyway, you'll know what I mean when you run into it. Maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense now, but again. Okay, so not a whole lot of, we'll just go through this really quickly. We have our onCreate, not a big deal. The one thing that you will see that we don't create the view here. There's no inflator to our content view. But if you go back to the main activity, in our onCreate, we do have that set content view. We're inflating our main activity. But again, in our fragment, most of the magic happens in onCreate view. And by magic, I mean the ability to get widgets, get references to widgets, UI widgets, and then manipulate the data or set click listeners on them. So again, this is from our notes. This is the line of code that Android Studio gives you. But again, if you're trying to manipulate these widgets, what you need to do is put it into a view first. So we're just going to say view equals return view. And the slide that I left out is if we want to get a reference to that view, or excuse me, to a UI widget. Right now we don't have anything, so let's go ahead and do that. So fragment gallery. This one says hello blank fragment gallery. Let's go ahead and delete that text view. This is what we call frame layout. Just means that whatever you put in there will take up the entire item. I'm going to put an image view in there. It's going to ask me what default image to put in. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. What you could do is like you could search for, I don't know, let's see if I was hoping for like a silhouette or something. Let's go ahead and put in that one or something. I don't know what I clicked on. All right, so again, this is just the default image, but we want a reference to this one. So I'm going to call it, I don't know, image view 2 is, let's call it profile image. Okay, so that's our ID for this view, and if this was inside an activity, you would say find view by ID r.id profile image. But in our fragment, it works slightly different. So in our fragment, again, we inflate this view, this layout called fragment gallery, which is this layout again. And the trick here is, again, if we were just to do, we do find view by ID, find view by ID, we pass in r.id.profile image, right? And that would give us back our image that we can then set the image programmatically. We can't do that. The difference is we have to do it within this view. So we call view dot find view by ID. Okay, so again, this is not in the notes, but I will add it. And this is going to be an image view. And here's where we put r.id profile image. That's going to pass back a image. So we're going to get a image. Let's call it a profile image view. And then from here we can set the bitmap data on that. All right, so I'll leave that in the source code for right now. I don't have any image data to actually set differently on it, so maybe that was a bad example to choose. But again, you get the idea. Button, click listeners, all that fun stuff still works. But what is important is now we have something to show on the screen besides our hello world item here. Okay, so let's go ahead and find that hello text view so that we can go ahead and change it. So if we start out in the activity main, which is again our main view with all those nested subviews within it, we have our app bar main. And again, you can just click in to these guys and find these items. So right now I clicked on hello world and I found out that this is yet another nested include in this. So let me double click on that, and almost nothing changed. But if we look at our component tree here, that is indeed what we were looking for. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. You might want to put something default there, or I don't know. I mean, you could always. What's going to happen now is nothing's going to show up until we hit the button, but that's okay for right now. The main thing I want to show you is we have this constraint layout, which doesn't really matter. Well, let me just change it to a frame layout. Again, you can change this to a relative layout, you can change it to a linear layout, whatever layout type you want, and then just start adding fragments to it, and then it'll lay out appropriately. But what we're going to want to do is the fragment that we put inside of here, we want to take up the entire screen, so a frame layout's probably the best choice for this one. And again, if you want multiple fragments, you choose a different layout. The more important thing is we need to add an ID so that in code we can take that newly created fragment and stick it here. So this one I just like to call container view or content view or whatever, because again, this is going to be the container that our fragment goes into. And in our main activity, in our onCreate, which is where we put most of our code or whatever in our activities, I am going to create a new fragment, but I'm going to create it as a class member here. So I call it gallery fragment of type gallery fragment. It's going to be optional. Okay, gallery fragment is going to be instantiated. You could do it this way using the class constructor. If we go back to our gallery fragment class and I scroll down, we have a companion object, and we talked a little bit about companion objects, but I think if not, companion objects are very similar to static methods and variables. If you ever want to have a static object or method in Kotlin, use a companion object. So that's exactly what this does. We have new instance, so that I'm able to call gallery fragment.newInstance, pass in some parameters, and then create a version of that gallery fragment and pass it back. Okay, so we can actually do that. We can pass in those parameters. The other thing that I need to do is implement this interface. So I said if you don't do that, it will crash, because what it'll do is when it gets on attached, we have this fragment listener, and if it is null, it goes into this else clause and it throws a runtime exception. So that's where that code gets called. If for whatever reason you don't want to implement it, well, first remove the code, or remove the interface, but that's where all that magic happens. Okay, let's go back to our main activity. So I'm just instantiating this. I'll call new, oops, this is on the class, not on the thing. And I'm able to put in, these are just two strings, so we could do string 1, comma, string 2. All right, so now we have this instance. If I ran this, nothing would happen. This gets instantiated. It gets captured in memory. It just sits there until it's ready. When I click on nav gallery, so that second menu item, I want to add that to my container. So right where that big white box was that says hello world, I want to add this fragment with the image to that. So if you remember, we get the fragment manager, and all of those, see if I can remember off the top of my head, but all those lines of code, first thing we want to do is begin transaction. And then under that, we can do all of our transactions. So really the main ones that we want to do, before I just try to remember this off the top of my head, one, we want to take the fragment and add it to a container, or in our case, what you can actually do, let me show you the code for that. So we can add a container, but what's going to happen is if we call this over and over and over and over again, it'll just pile on all of these fragments on top of each other. So if I do gallery and then I do, what's the one under it? Slideshow, manage, and I have fragments that correspond to each one of those will just kind of stack on top of each other, and they'll all be running at the same time. So instead what you want is the replace. So this was the one from the notes. But if you don't have anything in there, which we don't right now, handle that in a second, we'll want to use the replace function. Okay, so this says overloaded method, has two versions of it. One, you pass in the container. You remember I just gave that an ID. You pass in the fragment, and then if you want, you can pass in a tag, which helps you remember what fragment it is and whatever. So anyway, the container, it's asking for an int, but if you remember our resource file, our R class, these just evaluate to integers. And so this one, I totally forget, but there it is, container view. I was gonna say, I forgot what I named it. And then the second parameter is going to be the fragment that we want to put into that container. And that one was just called gallery fragments, part of the activities class. And let's see. Yes. So required is fragment, and it's looking at an optional. I'm trying to remember how I solved this. Let me do this. Let me set this to the parent type. Okay, so gallery is, of course, a gallery fragment. Gallery fragment is parent's class is still fragment. I don't think it likes the fact that it is a subclass of that. I'm drawing a blank on setting that. Fragment, instance. Oops. I just did this like a couple days ago, so I'm just trying to remember what I did. Required. I'm just trying to remember. I think that's okay. Not sure why it's really having problems with that. But anyway, let me go ahead and just code it up, and hopefully this will just work. Alrighty, sorry. So I'm just trying to get back, train of thought. Okay, so here we're instantiating it. Apparently I have to upcast it to a fragment, but so now it's in memory. And then again, when we are doing our fragment manager, we're going to take that one that's in memory, add it to that container view, just as is. Hopefully that exists, which I know it does, but let's just pass in the ID of it. All right, and then the next thing that we wanted to do is if we wanted to add it to the back stack, add to back stack. And this one, you give like an ID, so I don't know, we can just call almost whatever we want. Just call it gallery. Okay, so sorry, we go back to our steps that we want to do. We want to take the fragment, put it into the container, which we just did. If I hit back, I want to undo that action, so we add it to the back stack. And then the transition, or the transaction we want to do, so we can do add or transition. Fragment, transaction, and under the transition or the fragment transaction, we have a whole bunch of these constants that we can add. So let's try fade. You can see what this one does, and then finally, I think that's all the steps. We'll just commit all those options. I think I'm missing one, but I mean, you don't have to have these two. Mainly, like if you just have this one, then perfect. Okay, so anyway, obviously, if you want different views, when you tap on different buttons, just create another fragment. This one's going to crash, so let me go ahead and just get that out of the way so I can show you what happens and how to fix it. I'm going to play this. We're going to expand our log cat so we can see the crash happen. Let's go ahead and close that. Okay, there it goes. Yep. All right, so we just crashed right away. I haven't even clicked on the button yet, and you'd be like, well, what happened? I didn't even do anything. So if you look at your stack trace, and anytime you have any issues with Android Studio or Android in general, always look at your stack trace because it's going to give you invaluable information on that. And notably, if we look at it, it might not be too obvious what this is. It says inside of this package, gallery fragment cannot. Oh, okay, this one's actually a different error. It cannot be. Okay, here is. Okay, now I know why it wasn't matching up with the two different versions. My main application is looking for android.app.fragment. And if you remember, this is exactly what I talked about before, where we need to actually include the support library. So let's go ahead and look at our different imports. I didn't actually plan this, but this is exactly why I talked about this, because I was expecting a different crash. As you can see here, we have the import package android.app.fragment, and for whatever reason, when I created the fragment, there might have been a checkbox that I kind of skipped over. I was kind of going through it fast. It added the support library version of the fragment. So I have two options here. I can either change this package to android.app.fragment, or I can change the main activities, this one, to the version 4 fragment package. So when I clicked on, when I selected the Android version that I wanted to use, in this case it was KitKat, and that would satisfy, or that would be able to run on 95% of 95.3, whatever it was, percent of the devices out there. That was probably, that's really good. So if I keep this, I don't actually need the support library, because the support library allows me to go back farther before KitKat in version 4. But as you can see, there's other versions of the support library, version 7, I think there's a version 11, 13, and they all add different things. Let's put it that way. So version 4 is what I believe added fragments. And so in the support library version 4, we're able to have fragments in applications that run before, what is it, like, let's say, well, before Honeycomb, right? So 3.0 is Honeycomb. We're able to have fragments in versions prior to Honeycomb with that support library, but we're not going to do that. So after fragments came out in 4.0, or 3.0, excuse me, then, again, if we're not needing to run applications before that, then we don't need the support library. So I'm just going to use this one. Sorry, I was trying to think of other things, but yeah, that's the reason, and that's why I went into depth about why you should match up your fragment libraries. Yes, question?
So we should use the version 4.
Not if you're trying to support, if you're going from KitKat, which was, what was that, 19 or whatever version that was. If you're not, yeah, let's just say if you're not trying to support anything before version 3.0, which is Honeycomb, then you don't need the support library of version 4. But as I mentioned, there's a support library for version 7. I think there's one for 11, 13, and it goes beyond that. Each version support, when Android Studio came out with new technology, they made support libraries to be backwards compatible with earlier versions. So if you don't need that earlier version, then no, you do not need to import that library. So just fragments. So it doesn't.
For fragments.
Yeah. So if we do android.app.fragment, that basically takes care of us for version 3.0 and later. So right now we're on what are we on now? 11, whatever it is. So yeah, we're well beyond that. But again, Android has been introducing new technologies. So there's this activity, which is version 7, and they don't correspond. Well, just trying to think. I don't want to give you any false information, but it really depends on what you're trying to do. So again, if you're just using Fragments and you're only using like the latest version of Android, then you don't need the support library. But other things might need the support library. List views and recycler views. Actually, recycler views is a pretty good example where a recycler view was introduced with, oh, I can't remember now. Let's just say, and this is probably a lie, but let's say it was introduced with KitKat. If we're going KitKat and beyond, which we're doing this one, we don't need the support library for recycler views. If we are, and even if it's one version prior, then we need the support library. So yeah, it's kind of a pain in the butt, but welcome to Android and backwards compatibility. Okay, so anyway, sorry about that. That was again a long introduction or a long explanation.
Is iOS like that?
Nope. So the question is iOS like that? iOS, Apple has been historically anti-backwards compatible, which is really good as a developer because you don't have to support early versions of whatever. They just say, hey, your device, yeah, it's 2 years old, but it's obsolete. Go buy a new one. So yeah, people get mad about that, but as a developer, it's like, oh, thank God. Whereas some Android developers are still supporting version 2.2, 2.3. As a general rule for Android development, I like to support at least 80% of the users, so whatever that is, because sometimes what happens is if you go by the statistics in Android Studio, that includes worldwide statistics, not just US. So really, if your market is just the US, people in the US tend to recycle not recycle, but cycle through their phones every year or two because they get new phones, whereas other parts of the world don't want to spend $1,000 or $500 on a phone every year, so they tend to keep their older phones or whatever. And so that data might be a little skewed in terms of how old operating systems are. So again, 80% for me is usually a good number. And you can do your own unscientific poll and just ask your friends and your parents and whatever. It's like, hey, what version are you on for Android? And you'll probably see that they're on, I don't know, probably Marshmallow and beyond if their phone is within a year or two. But again, it depends.
So can I ask you one more question?
You may ask all the questions you want.
Do you remember that idea I told you about where there's like this little circular button, hit the app icon and a little circular button, and you said the newest Android operating system has this thing where if you hold it down, it pops up a little thing?
Yes, so that was the long touch menu that pops up, yeah, on the app icon.
So what I want to do is I actually want to hit the application and then have it pop up, not doing the long press thing. What I found out is you can make the activity in the layout clear,
Okay.
so you can still see the app icons behind it. And then I was wondering, if you make the activity clear, can you make buttons on top of it that's still visible? And I can get away with doing that. Or even do a fragment or something where it's a circle.
So in terms of that menu that pops up when you long tap it, I have very little experience with actually implementing it, so
I'm saying completely ignore that.
Okay.
Just basic application programming. The activity screen, like the white one with the little floating mail icon that you have.
Yeah.
The drawer. That can be clear, completely clear. And I know obviously that you can put buttons on an activity screen,
Yep.
right? Can you make the button itself still visible and with the white activity background screen completely invisible? So it would just appear that there was just a button there on the screen.
Oh, so you're talking about making the entire application transparent, so you can see your desk, your main your home screen behind it.
Yeah, and I know you can do that because I looked that up. So you can do that, make it invisible. But my question is, if the activity invisible, does that characteristic pass on to all the buttons that are on top of it?
I have no idea, but probably. So I know for a fact that if you make the container, whether that's an activity or a subview, everything under that, all the children UI elements under that also become that same transparency. But yeah, I don't know exactly, like you're talking about making the entire activity, because the activity itself is not, the activity itself is just code. You want to do the view that the activity contains, and if you're trying to do the view that the activity, or excuse me, the view that's on the screen for that activity that represents the layout, the content view.
I want to see the children, I guess, as you're saying, of the activity, but not the activity.
No, but there's ways around that. You can make siblings, but again, I don't know if you can make the view transparent. I've never done that before, so can't say whether you can make the entire application transparent without making its children transparent. Give it a try. Yeah, it's just mostly it's things that I've either come across or I've obviously done myself, and that's definitely not one that I've done myself. But if you do it, let me know because I'd be super curious. Anyway, getting to the actual crash that I wanted to do, I was going to say. So I've activated the crash there, which is exactly what I wanted. And then if you look at your stack trace, this is the one that I was looking at. So again, that other stack trace was different. This one says you must implement on fragment interaction listener. You go, okay, what the heck is that? Well, I showed you a couple minutes ago. And you don't really have to do anything with this. Let me make this screen a little bit bigger. Okay, so inside of our gallery fragment, if you remember when I created this, this class, there was a checkbox that said implement the interface. What that did, kind of showed that to you, is, well, it's this guy here. Here's the interface. And it's requiring that I implement that in my main activity if I want my main activity to use that fragment. So all I have to do in Kotlin, when we declare a class, what comes immediately after it's the parent class, and then after that is all the interfaces that it has to or that it's going to implement. So this is a way, if you've ever seen multiple inheritance, most languages don't have them because they're very confusing. Instead, they use interfaces to kind of get that behavior. So mine was, what I can just do is, I think I can just type in listener. No, that won't work. Let me go ahead and copy that. Oh, on fragment listener. Okay, it's going to ask me which package comes from. Yep. So all I have to do is say, yep, this implements it, but I don't really have to do anything with it. Or I don't have to implement the code. But the compiler is going to say, yes, you do. Say, okay. So if I click on anywhere in this red under squiggly thing here, I should get a red light bulb. If I click on that red light bulb, I can say implement the members, and it's going to say on fragment interaction, do you want to implement this? Go ahead and create it, and it creates the function for you. So you don't really have to remember any of that. Let me just put it down here at the bottom because I usually don't do a whole lot with it. Oh yeah, don't let it get called either. This will crash too. So you can put in these to-dos, and they're kind of like asserts. If you've ever used asserts, if that line code gets called, it'll crash. The URI is just what the fragment, where the fragment location is. All right, so that's all I had to do to avoid that crash. And we're almost done. But I always forget to implement that because I create the fragment and then I do a whole bunch of programming on it. And if I don't do this right away, I always forget, and then my application crashes and I have to do it. So call that out. Okay, so here's our application. Go to our menu, click on gallery, and didn't create it. Why is that? Let's put a breakpoint there. Let's see, gallery fragment. Make sure we're inflating the view. Gallery fragment. Okay, we do that. That does nothing. And then we do the gallery. Okay, container view. Should exist. Gives me a number. We are replacing. Let me try adding one to. Let me try adding this because I think there might need to be something there for me to replace. Usually when the application loads up, like in the onCreate, I'll call this all these lines of code in my onCreate so that there's something in that main view. I was kind of hoping we can save some time and just do replace, but it should work. Container view. Okay, let me do one more thing and then I'll let you go in case this doesn't work, and I'll debug it and fix it later. If we go to our fragment gallery, or no, sorry, our content main container view, let me add a sub layout here. Let's do a vertical layout. I don't have my backup code that I actually implemented this up. Otherwise, I just copy and paste, see what I did differently. I think I missed a step, but. Gallery. That is not working. Let me try one more thing and I'll let you guys go. Just making sure that those widgets weren't being hidden below the toolbar. Guess I don't have a profile view image anymore. Okay. Again, I probably missed a step. We'll talk about it next class if this doesn't work. Okay, it was working. So whatever reason, the image view wasn't showing up, so I just added a whole bunch of default widgets in there that I knew would show up, and apparently that was the cause of that not showing up. So my image view, again, wasn't showing up for whatever reason. Just changed it to a vertical layout and threw some stuff in there to show up by default, and that's what would happen. So right now this application doesn't really show anything besides that one fragment, but again, just add another version of the fragment. So we'll continue that next class, but there it is. Thank you for coming out. If you have any questions, I'll be here for a little bit.
How hard is it to implement push notifications in an app?
So I would probably use like a third-party library for that, whether it's like Firebase or they do, because what you need to have is on the app on the phone, you need to register for that. That sends it up to the Google Cloud service, and then on a separate server, you know, using PHP or
We have a
or
Node.js server.
There you go, Node. So from Node, you'd have to call up to the cloud, the Google Cloud servers, passing up your credentials and all that fun stuff, and then pass up a payload for that push notification. But not only that is you need the ID for that phone. So when your phone registers, says yes, I care about push notifications, it passes up that device ID, and then in your server, you need to keep that device ID around in a database, and then use that to push up to the Google Cloud server. So there's a lot of different moving parts to that.
Yeah.
And so for Firebase, all you have to do for Firebase is just include the Firebase library, and it handles all that stuff, including saving the device ID and all the server-side stuff. And then when you need to talk to that device, that's part of either the account or it's part of the well, it's part of the account, and then you can go into Firebase and say send a message to this user, or you can programmatically do it. So it's a lot easier. Kind of takes away.
I've just heard horror stories about Firebase cost management. Like some people like that, it's like it can end up being like 20 grand a month or something.
I
Something
just wanted
insane.
to tell you something.
Yes.
There's an elevator.
Oh, thank you. I
So-
kind of hurt my back, so thank you. You can put in quotas for Firebase and just say either alert me when it gets up to 10
Okay,
bucks.
like AWS.
What's that?
Like AWS.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can definitely say stop all services. If you're getting up to that, something's going wrong. Somebody probably hacked your service and just doing that. But
Cool.
they do give you like a free tier of a couple thousand requests per
I've
month.
seen Firebase. I just don't want to pay $25 a month to implement it, but I'll contact my sponsor and see if he wants to. So
Okay, yeah, as I said, there's a free version, and then even there's one that right now we're on one that's pay as you go. You get a bunch of ones for free, and then they give you like $300.
you get so there is a free version because the cheapest I saw was $25 a month.
Now there's a free version, but again, it's a limit for as you're
Oh,
developing.
that's fine. That's fine. For now, that's fine. 'Cause,
Yeah.
like it's for my senior design project.
Okay,
So.
yeah, use it then.
Cool.
We'll
Thank
cover
you.
it in a future class too. So
Thank you so
no
much.
worries. Yep, thank you.
So I sent you an email. I haven't gotten a grade yet for any of the homework.